Georges Pavis was born in 1886, and unfortunately all I've been able to find, biographically speaking, are a couple of lines from French Wikipedia. But it is at least recorded that in his later teens he studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and within a couple of years of graduation at the age of 25, he started to have his work published in the popular humour magazine Le Sourire. This piece of original artwork from the time gives a particularly clear view of his favoured technique. Pen and brush line of widely varying thickness formed the basis of the image, which was then coloured in washes of watercolour or possibly diluted gouache. When war broke out in 1914, Pavis joined the army to fight for his country, but was wounded in battle and invalided out. Luckily, whatever his injuries were, they didn't prevent him from continuing to work during the later years of the conflict. And surprisingly, his visual references to the ongoing war were remarkably upbeat and absurdist given his own recent experience. In 1918 he also started working for the magazine La Vie Parisienne, and although humour continued to be a regular feature in his illustrations for this magazine, he also developed a still comedic but noticeably more representational approach to anatomy, and particularly with regard to a growing number of erotic depictions of females. This was only to be expected for such a notoriously permissive publication, and although he carried on with broader comedy, it was undoubtedly images of young ladies in various permutations of undress that came to dominate his output into the 1920s. Now, with two regular high-profile clients, he became one of Paris's most celebrated illustrators of the decade, and as with several of his contemporaries, such as the equally popular and stylistically similar Armand Vallet, he also introduced a series of more complex, crowded compositions for La Vie as duotone double-page spreads. By the middle of the decade, it appears that he had gravitated increasingly to La Vie Parisienne, and although he continued to appear in Le Sourire, it was with conspicuously less frequency than earlier in his career. But the volume of images he created during the exuberant permissive years of the French Année Folle clearly shows he was a dominant and highly popular visual comedic presence throughout. As the 1930s rolled around, Pavis was concentrating more on bookwork. In 1933, his illustrated edition of Roland Dorgel's account of the misery of war, Les Croix de Bois, was published, and this was followed by another similar account, Le Cabaret de la Belle Femme. Both books revealed a more thoughtful and compassionate side of Pavis's approach, and his quite brutally rendered monochromes successfully conveyed the misery of life in the trenches. In 1937 and 1938 he illustrated two collections written by Jean Marais, better known by the name Dumel. These droll accounts were accompanied by line-only doodles by Pavis throughout. Unsurprisingly, I found nothing at all from the years of the Second World War, but when it was over in 1945, he published similarly deceptively casual vignettes, this time in colour, satirising the notoriously undemanding world of the senior civil service. A year later he produced similar but conspicuously more risque images for two collections of quotes by various figures from history on the subject of sex, titled For and Against Love. The book proved to be a popular success, and it was quickly followed by another titled For and Against Women. This seems to have been Georges Pavis's last published work, and unfortunately I can't tell you with any certainty his year of death. As some assert it was as late as 1977, and other more credible sources claim it was 1951, when he would have been 65. Walter Spradbery was born in 1889 in London, and in his teens he studied at Walthamstow Art School. He subsequently took a job as an art teacher, and at this early stage of his career he worked primarily as an artist, producing watercolours, lino cuts and lithographs. Nevertheless, as early as 1912, when he was still only 23, he also began creating scenic posters for London Transport. And in this context he was one of a relatively small group of illustrators and designers who were pushing at the boundaries of poster art into what was, in Britain at least, fairly uncharted modernist territory. But unfortunately, along with so many others of his generation, this early surge in his career was swiftly brought to an end by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Spradbury was a staunch pacifist, and to remain faithful to his beliefs, he served as an orderly in the Army Medical Corps, apparently with considerable bravery and disregard for his own safety on the Western Front. In the years immediately after the end of the war, he picked up the threads of his art and illustration careers and steadily rebuilt a stronger reputation than previously in both fields. More commissions from London Transport came in thick and fast, and his ability to create evocative posterised compositions of scenic locations, which could be quickly understood by potential travellers, made him a popular choice for such work. Although he didn't stop working as an artist, by this point it was undoubtedly his poster work that was the reason for his growing reputation. His aesthetic sensibilities were obvious in the compelling tranquil composition of his images, and he used colour with equal sensitivity to evoke the bucolic nature of his scenes, none of which featured figures, even on an incidental basis. In 1929, Spradbury married opera singer Dorothy Dorsey, and the couple relocated to Epping Forest, just to the north of the capital. And by this point, noticeably more painterly scenes were also beginning to appear among the more expected, flatter graphic approach used in his poster designs. At the same time, he also created several particularly impressive close-quarter images of the beauties of nature for London Transport, and the popular success of his floral depictions led to quite a few more in the early 30s, some of which artfully offered both a scenic element and closer floral detail within the same poster. Posters for London Transport, undoubtedly Spradbury's most frequent and possibly even his only client, continues to dominate his commercial output into the later 1930s, at which point he also began creating some of his images as bold lino cuts using striking limited colour palettes, a technique which gave these close-up images more than usually well-defined graphic appearance, possessed of considerable nostalgic appeal. His entirely different but nevertheless appealing watercolour landscapes still sold to collectors, and during the Second World War he produced a series of posters which unusually for Spradbury were urban scenes, gathered under the collective title The Proud City, and they were displayed throughout the capital as a morale booster for the war-weary public. In the years immediately following the war, examples of Spradbury's illustrations become harder to find, and the last I found were a couple of poorly printed postcards from 1948. But even if he stopped working commercially, he continued to paint watercolours and make limited edition lithographs well into old age. And Walter Spradbury died in Epping in 1969 at the age of 80. Despite his very Italian-sounding name, Leon Benigni was born in Paris in 1892. It's recorded that at the age of 18 in 1910, he unfathomably relocated to Hanover in Germany and took a job working in a bank. But I suspect he soon realised that banking was not to be his life's work, and he may have subsequently studied art somewhere, although I found no record that he did. But with or without formal training, in 1918 it's recorded that he started work in Paris as a theatre and fashion designer. But I found nothing dated from this time to support this assertion, and the best I can do is show dated work from 1925 onwards, by which point his success as a staunchly modernist illustrator had attracted major clients such as Vogue and Femina magazine. Before the decade was out, he was also appearing regularly on the covers of Harper's Bazaar, with some fine geometric line and flat colour, quite radically styled images. And throughout the decade, his languidly posed and elongated figure work appeared regularly in all the major fashion and style magazines of the period. It wasn't until the end of the 1920s that Benigni created any advertising work, at which point he produced this striking travel poster, capitalising on the reputation he had acquired as a fashion artist. This debut was followed in 1930 with a remarkably stylish series of press advertisements promoting Cadillac's luxurious LaSalle V8 car. All the ads portrayed the vehicle in all manner of configurations and colours as a simple clean profile image set against images of women out and about at the sort of venues the wealthy and fashionable would attend. I don't know how successful the campaign was, although the sheer volume he created suggests it must have met with a favourable response. But subsequently Benigni returned almost exclusively to the more familiar magazine and fashion work. And by the middle of the 1930s, his style had now become conspicuously less formal and driven by the devices and methods which had defined what was by now being called Art Deco. But having been a significant driving force among others who began and consolidated that style, he had evidently tired of it and was now using a more gestural impressionistic style with calligraphic line work and tonally painted colour. And other than the years of World War II, when pretty much all such frivolity ceased in occupied Paris, it was this method of working with which he ended his career, the last example I found coming from 1948, which was also the year he died in Marseille at the age of only 56. Robert Riggs was born in Illinois in 1896, and it's recorded that in his teens he spent some time working in a circus, although I don't know in what capacity. Not much later he was awarded a scholarship to study at the Art Students League in New York, but when the USA joined the Allies in early 1917, he served with a hospital unit in Western Europe. And once the war had ended, he enrolled at Paris's prestigious art school, the Académie Julian. With his training completed, he returned to the USA and worked briefly in Philadelphia for NWA or Unsung. But not only can I not show you any of his work from this period, in the mid-1920s Riggs quit his job and travelled extensively around the world to numerous far-flung exotic locations. And it wasn't until 1930 or so when meaningful evidence of his work began to appear. At this point he was working exclusively as an artist, and he had some early success with various series of grainy monochrome lithographs, as well as some strikingly solid oil paintings. Among the many prints and paintings he produced throughout the decade, boxing was a recurring theme, and he was obviously particularly adept at expressing the drama and frequently brutal nature of the sport. And he had his greatest artistic success to date with his painting of Joe Louis's victory over German boxer Max Schmeling, titled The Brown Bomber in 1938. But that was also the year that he created this impressive crowd scene for Esquire magazine, which appears to have been his conspicuously late debut as an illustrator at the age of 42. More magazine work followed, and in the same year he also created a series of painted illustrations of his fellow humans at play at the Coney Island amusement park, and managed to make it all look rather sinister and far from fun. A year later, more of his work was published in the prestigious Fortune magazine, including an extensive article about the role of the New York Mounted Police. And although he was still producing paintings and art prints, illustration was starting to become noticeably more prevalent in his output. During the Second World War he created a few propaganda posters, some press ads and magazine illustrations, all of which reflected dramatically on the conflict. But he also produced magazine work which avoided the subject in favour of more domestic matters. It was in 1944 that he painted his first cover illustration for the Saturday Evening Post, and although he continued to appear in other magazines, the Post would before long be his most regular client. Sport, including more images of boxing matches, became a recurring theme in his work, but baseball was another subject which brought out the best in him. All of it featuring broadly representational but nevertheless distinctively expressionistic and anatomically monolithic characters. His popularity in the Post inevitably led to offers of advertising work from the later 1940s onwards, as press campaigns for various clients, quite a few of whom appear to have latched onto his knack for brutalist solidity, making his style well suited to heavy industry. In this regard, Riggs was, to my knowledge at least, a unique presence in 1950s American commercial illustration, with a dark and frequently brooding atmosphere not generally found in magazines and advertising at that time, and never as propaganda for the American dream as promulgated by Norman Rockwell and many others. Throughout the 1950s, Riggs continued to be a fairly ubiquitous presence in the Post, in both colour and monochrome. And although not his only subject, it was boxing which still dominated his output. He continued to find favour with advertising clients too, and he saw in the 1960s with this imposing historical double-page spread for Life magazine. The last dated work I found by Robert Riggs was arguably one of his finest collections, a series of spectacular swirling monochromes created in graphite to illustrate the legends of the Lenape Indians, which was published in 1966. If he had been looking for an appropriate, less overtly commercial body of work to be his most fitting legacy, he couldn't, in my view, have chosen a better one. And he died in 1970 at the age of 74. I hope you found this diverse collection of illustrative talents interesting, and I very much hope you'll come back for more when they're uploaded.